What's up, Dragon Brood? So now that we have a Crimson Vow releasing, I figured I put all these deck lists together. Let's talk about my favorite cards that I actually really like from this set. And maybe some are pretty powerful, some less than others, some are going to be pet cards, but these are going to be my top 13 favorite cards from Innistrad Crimson Vow. Okay, let's start with one of the obvious ones. I'm not even gonna count this. This one's gonna be an honorable mention, if you will. This is Hero's Downfall. It's a reprint. It's good. It actually got downgraded from a rare to an uncommon, which is great because it'll be easier for people to get their hands on. And it just unconditionally kills a creature or a planeswalker for 3 mana. Not really much else to say about it other than this card's just really good, and I expect to play it in a whole lot of decks. And here's another one before we get into the meat and potatoes, if you will. This is Fleeting Spirit, colorless, and a white for a 3/1 spirit. Pay 1, exile 3 cards from your graveyard. Fleeting Spirit gains first strike till end of turn. You can discard a card, exile Fleeting Spirit, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. The reason I like this card is 1, it's a 3/1 for 2, and it has a chance to just keep coming back. Here's an interesting thing too is it allows itself to be exiled from the graveyard. So what's funny is that even if somebody were to actually try to exile it or exile your graveyard, you could actually discard a card to exile it first to protect it, and then have it come back during that turn's end step. So it's a pretty interesting card. Now, does it have a home anywhere? I don't know. Maybe it goes into the Spirit decks now that we have enough stuff in Crimson Vow to play with. But I actually thought it was just something pretty interesting. Wouldn't be surprised if it shows up in some deck lists, but it's not the most powerful 2 mana thing you can play right now in Standard. But it's definitely one, maybe that next rotation, to kind of just keep an eye on. Alright, so this officially starts the list. I wasn't counting those others. But this is number 13 on my list. And this is Hopeful Initiate. It's a 1 mana, 1/2. It has training, and you can pay 3 mana to remove 2 +1/+1 counters from creatures you control to destroy an artifact or enchantment. Actually pretty good. I like the idea that this actually lets the aggressive decks kind of cheat a little bit on not having to have so many what we call disenchant type effects to destroy artifacts and enchantments, and still let you be aggressive. It actually can grow over time with training, and it fits a couple of different deck types. Because you have cards that already exist, like, well, really, Luminarch Aspirant, namely, because that card's ridiculous and it goes in every white aggro deck. But there's a few others, obviously. And I think you don't need a lot of +1/+1s to really make this worthwhile. I think the trick will just be deciding how many creatures you need that produce +1/+1s to make this worth playing over other 1 mana creatures that come with the preset ability that's already good for the deck you're playing. Number 12, Anja, Maid of Dishonor. 2 colorless, red-black, 4/5. Ridiculousness of making a blood token every time a vampire comes into the battle. Well, actually, when Anja or a vampire comes into the battlefield. And then you could pay 2 mana to sacrifice a creature or a blood counter. I don't want to keep on calling it a blood vial. It's a blood counter. Maybe they keep it in a vial. I don't know. But it's a blood counter to drain your opponent for 2 life. So they lose 2, you gain 2. The really cool thing about Anja, well, first off, is that it's 4 mana for a 4/5. So a really good sizable creature for the mana cost. Gives you tons of blood tokens, most likely. But more importantly, if you've had blood tokens building up during the course of the game, Anja can just show up on, like, I don't know, turn 10 or 12 and just start draining your opponent right when she hits the field. And bare minimum, she's going to make 1 blood token anyway. So even if you just have 6 mana, that's at least a 4/5 and a 2 mana drain on your opponent. That's actually pretty cool. This card's going to really get played. Might be the best of the 4 mana vampires we got in this set. Alright, what number is this? We're on number 11. I don't know why I'm losing track of the numbers. Reclusive Taxidermist. This is a 1 colorless and a green 1/2 human druid. Gets +3/+2 as long as you have 4 or more creatures in the graveyard. Tap to add 1 mana of any color. The biggest thing for me on this card is we've been playing so many worse creatures that are 2 mana to tap and add a mana. Whether it's just add a green, or add any color, or if you have I don't know, creatures with power 4 or greater, it adds 2 mana. Like, we've had all these different variations on this card. But this time we actually get a 1/2 creature for 2 mana. It's not a 1/1, so that's already a step up. But then there's a possibility that later in the game, when you don't need it to just produce mana as much, you get a 4/4 for your troubles. That seems really good. I mean, in older formats, we played junk like Werebear. Come on. This card's really good. And it's an uncommon, so I expect this card's going to show up in a lot of places. This is a great filler card when you're talking about splashing colors and limited. There's just a lot of really good things going on with this creature, and it happens to be a human, so it fits some of those options as well, and we're trying to fit in different types of human decks. If you need to put it into a ramp deck, like, this is going to fill a lot of different spots. Alright, my number 10 on this list, Overcharge Amalgam. A card I'm going to probably end up hating by the time of its life in Standard. 2 colorless, blue, 3/3, creature, zombie horror, flash, flying, exploit. Whenever it enters the battlefield, you can sacrifice a creature. When Overcharge Amalgam exploits a creature, counter target spell, activated ability, or triggered ability, which basically is all abilities. So this card probably will show up in more decks. Matter of fact, the Simic deck I built and put up a couple days ago, I'm probably going to be adding 2 copies of this card. Because late in the game, I might have a mana creature I don't need anymore, and I'm like, great, I could use this. And then, because I'm already playing the big new Kraken thing, I can go ahead and bounce this, and now I have access to a counterspell all over again. Like, this card is really good. I would not be surprised if it shows up in way more decks than you want it to. We're all going to be sick and tired of playing around this card. It even happens to be a 3/3 on top of everything else that flies, so it doesn't even really have a downside. This card's really good, y'all. Alright, number 9. Falconwrath Forebear. This is the 3 mana, 3/1 flyer. Can't block, small downside, but every time it connects, you get to make a blood token. And a little bonus, you can pay a black and sacrifice 2 blood tokens and return it from the graveyard to the battlefield. That's really good. This is another one of those cards that you can keep coming back over and over, even after board sweepers. Now, obviously, it's exiled. That doesn't really matter. But it still leaves behind the blood tokens, if nothing else. And we already know there's several other cards that take advantage of those, but make use of them. There you go. 2 different sentences. But in all seriousness, this is a really good card. A 3/1 flyer for 3 with an upside. Actually, really 2 upsides. That's great value on a card. And again, we want to use those blood tokens for so many things. So yeah, this isn't going to be the last mention we make of blood tokens here on this list. Number 8, Hullbreaker Horror. 5, blue, for a 7/8 flash. Yes, that's a lot of mana. This spell can't be countered. Whenever you cast a spell, choose up to 1, return target spell you don't control to its owner's hand. Return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. The thing about this card that I think makes it very good is that it's a spell you don't control that gets returned, but just a permanent period that gets returned. So this lets you reuse all of your valuable stuff. If you have something that bounces something when it comes into play, do you have something that draws cards? Do you have something, as we saw earlier in this list, that counters a spell? You can return those things back to your hand. This is really, really good. This card's going to be a problem if it sticks. And because if you basically have like a half a turn to deal with it, and if you don't, things might get really, really bad. So yeah, this guy, and it's a 7/8. This thing is huge. So yeah, expect to see some of this card for sure. Number 7, Headless Rider. This is basically the 3rd iteration they've made of a Headless Horseman in Magic, but this one I think might actually stick. I mean, one, the artwork's pretty crazy with like all the skulls flying around. I don't know if those are the skulls he collected of people or what. It's kind of creepy, but kind of cool. The horse also has weird glowing eyes, but hell, it's Innistrad. But it's a 3 mana, 3/1 that whenever you have another non-token zombie die, you get a 2/2 zombie on top of it. So this actually just gives you full protection from board sweepers of various kinds. It lets you run your creatures into combat and not worry about it. Or if you have sacrifice abilities, you get to replace your creature with a new 2/2. So there's going to be a lot of uses for this card, just depending on where you want to put it. And a 3/1 for 3, power to cost is pretty good. The 1 toughness is a little bit of a bummer. But hey, even if it dies, you're going to get a 2/2, so it's not that bad. Number 6, Uvenwald Oddity. This one's one I want this one of all of them probably is one of the worst on my list, but I want it to be good so bad. But it's a 2 green green for a 4/4 trample haste. It's gonna get some play somewhere. That alone makes it playable, right? You can play it after sweepers. You can just keep bum rushing your opponent. You can get under big problematic stuff, like if you want to get ahead against the Epiphany decks. It also kind of keeps you on task, if you will, and on turn, where you can just attack the turn you play it, even if stuff gets bounced or you fall behind tempo-wise. But then you could pay 7, 5 green green, to turn it into an 8/8 that also has haste and trample, and, which I'm not really sure why it has haste, because it already have haste if it's in play, but whatever. The interesting thing is, other creatures you control get +1/+1 and also have trample. So it's a way to pump your team, give everything else trample, and it's a good mana sink, right? Because there's a lot of times you don't necessarily want to play something or commit to things, but then during your opponent's end step, you're like, all right, fine, I'll go ahead and spend my mana. Now I have an 8/8, deal with this thing. And I love that it can do all this as just one card. That's the other big thing to me. That you could just draw this off the top and your opponent has to deal with this, or it possibly just ends the game by itself. Number 5, Savior of Olembach. 1 white, 1/2. Soldier human, has training. Whenever Savior of Olembach trains, exile up to 1 other target creature from the battlefield or creature from a graveyard. When Savior of Olembach leaves the battlefield, put the exile card onto the battlefield under your owner's control. Now, I want to say, first off, generally speaking, this isn't that much better than other cards we already have, like the White Werewolf that removes stuff and Skyclave Apparition and all that, right? We have a series of cards that already do this. And they're not conditional because they just do it whenever they enter the battlefield. However, this can actually remove... Now, admittedly, it has to train first, so let's assume you can. It actually removes any creature. There's no restriction. It doesn't care about cost, doesn't care about type. You can just remove anything. And you get your choice of removing stuff from the graveyard. So if you think there's something your opponent may get back, you can remove that. If there's something you just want to get back in the future, you get that. Because when this card leaves the battlefield, you get to return all those exile cards to the battlefield. So what this means is you can get stuff out of your own graveyard and protect it. So now if your board gets swept, you still have creatures. If maybe this thing gets bounced, you still have creatures. If it gets exiled, you still have creatures, right? The thing is, this doesn't even say when it dies. It just says when it leaves the battlefield. It is worded in the best way possible for you to get the most out of this card. It has to be better than we initially thought it was, because this is just such a unique and good ability for white to have. I mean, yeah, Thalia, Guardian of Thraben. If you don't know, go find out. There's really not much else to say. This card's good in every format it's available in. You're going to play it. Go ahead and craft it. Cemetery Gatekeeper. This comes in at what? Our number 3. 1 colorless, 1 red. 2/1. First strike. When it enters the battlefield, exile a card from a graveyard. Whenever a player plays a land or casts a spell, if it shares a card type with the exiled card, Cemetery Gatekeeper deals 2 damage to that player. Now, here's a really fun thing about this card. You could put it into a discard type scenario. So if your opponent discards a land into their graveyard early, well, you remove a land, and now every land they play is going to deal 2 damage to them. You could play it against a control type deck, where maybe they play an early thing that lets them search for a card or draw extra cards. Well, then now, every time they play an instant or a sorcery, they're going to take 2 damage. It also is a 2/1 first striker, so it's actually not terrible in combat. This card is really good for the value. Even if you just play it as a creature, its ability is kind of just all upside, all bonus, really. And it's also a vampire, so it fits into a lot of those lists, too. Remember how I told you there was going to be more blood mentioned? Well, here's some more blood tokens. On our number 2 card, the Voldaren Bloodcaster. 1 colorless and a black, 2/1, flying. Whenever Voldaren Bloodcaster or another non-token creature you control dies, create a blood token. So pretty much every time you have something go to the yard, you're getting a token. And then whenever you create a blood token, if you control 5 or more blood tokens, transform Voldaren Bloodcaster. Let it be known that that blood token that flips this doesn't have to come from the Bloodcaster. So if you play an Anja and make one, if you connect with the Falconwrath Forebear and make your 5th blood token, that will still flip this Bloodcaster. So yeah, Make sure you're reading those cards correctly. There's a lot of stuff going on here. But when it flips, it's now a 3/3 flyer, and at the beginning of combat on your turn, up to one target blood token you control becomes a 2/2 bat. Randomly has haste, which is amusing to me. But you can turn your blood tokens into bats and have a 3/3. It's not going to be hard to flip this card, y'all. This is going to be some real upside, some real fun stuff here. I really think this card is going to be really, really good. And you don't even necessarily have to play it in a vampire deck that has a bunch of blood tokens. You could just have it be a relevant 2/1 flyer and maybe some type of aggro scenario. Maybe you have just a hint of blood action going on, and it still has a reasonable upside. And number 1, the Manaform Hellkite, 2 colorless, red, 4/4, flying. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, create an XX red dragon illusion creature token with flying and haste, where X is the amount of mana spent to cast the spell. Exile that token at the beginning of the next end step. I mean, this card, everything you play to kill your opponents, to kill a creature, is just going to generate one more creature you get to attack with. Even more amusing is if you have instants, you could actually create instant speed blockers. This card is really good. Does it have a home in a bunch of places? I don't know, but the 1 or 2 places it shows up, it's probably going to be really damn good. All right, that's it. That's my top 13 favorite cards from, well, I guess technically it was like 15 because I had some honorable mentions, but you know what I'm saying, my top 13 cards from Innistrad Crimson Vow. Let me know if there's something you disagreed with, a card you hate, maybe one of your favorites I didn't even mention, or if you even like these types of videos. I don't know, you tell me. But there's some really good cards in this set, and more importantly, I think a lot of these cards are better if you take your time to read them appropriately, because I think there's sometimes on a lot of these cards you're going to read them and think they work one way, but when you get into the dirty details they actually work another way, and that really changes the value of some of these cards. Don't forget to like and subscribe, check out my other content, there's a bunch of links in the description below, but that's all I have for you for now. We'll see you next time.